Welcome to Madlik. My name is Jeffrey Stern, and at Madlik we like to shed a little light or light a spark around a Jewish custom or text. And since this week is Hanukkah, a week where we light the candles and say a blessing, lahadlik ner shel Hanukkah, we're going to shed a little light on this amazing holiday. But before I begin, I want to remind you that you can subscribe to the Madlik podcast on iTunes or Google Play Music. If you want an easy link to do that, you can go to madlik.com, and there are links there. And if you do like us, give us a star, send us a like, or write a nice comment. So sit back, fasten your seatbelts, put down your dreidel, have another vodka with your latke, and let's listen to the mystery of Hanukkah. So normally this time of year, Jews in the diaspora especially talk about the December dilemma. The dilemma of celebrating Hanukkah, a minor Jewish festival, and we have to compare it and we have to celebrate it in an environment where other people are celebrating a holiday of goodwill to man, of the birth of a new age. Today in the podcast, we're not going to discuss the December dilemma, at least not directly. Instead, we're going to discuss the Hanukkah dilemma. And by that I mean that if you read the original story of Hanukkah in Maccabees 1 and 2, there's no mention of a miracle of oil lasting 8 days. There rather is a story of a revolt where Jewish zealots, led by Judah the Maccabee and his family, fought the Hellenists and fought the Seleucids and brought the purity of Judaism back and rededicated the temple. In fact, they do talk about celebrating an 8-day holiday, but it has nothing to do with a miracle of oil. Rather, it has to do with the holiday of Sukkot, which typically occurs in September, which was missed because the Jews were in caves, hiding out and planning their revolt. And so when the temple was redeemed and the Seleucid Greek sympathizers and the Greeks were kicked out of the temple and the Holy Land, the Jews were free now to celebrate the holiday of Sukkot. And I read from 2 Maccabees 10:6-7. They celebrated it for 8 days with gladness like Sukkot, and recalled how a little while before, during Sukkot, they had been wandering in the mountains and caverns like wild animals. So, carrying lulavs, the palm branches, they offered hymns of praise to God, who brought to pass the purification of his own place. So how is it that the rabbis created a holiday 250 years after this revolt that hardly mentions the wars fought by these zealots, and instead almost emasculates it and turns it into a little minor holiday where we celebrate a miracle of oil? In the Babylonian Talmud, Shabbat 21b, the rabbis ask, what is the reason for Hanukkah? For our rabbis taught, on the 25th of Kislev begin the days of Hanukkah, which a lamentation for the dead and fasting are forbidden. For when the Greeks entered the temple, they defiled all the oil therein. When the Hasmonean dynasty prevailed against and defeated them, they searched and found only one jug of oil, which lay with the seal of the high priest, but which contained enough for 1 day's lighting only. Yet a miracle occurred, and they lit the lamp for 8 days. The following year, these days were appointed a festival with the recitation of Hallel and thanksgiving. So one little telltale sign here is that when it refers to the Maccabees, it actually refers to the Hasmonean dynasty. In the Hebrew, it talks of Malchut Beit Hashmonai, the kingdom of the house of Hashmonai. The truth is that the word nes, miracle, according to Nachmanides, can also mean a sign, a symbol, or a great test. So what was this miracle? What was this great test that the rabbis refer to? And why did they totally sanitize the holiday of these zealots? Now, many people have argued that the rabbis had a problem with power. The rabbis were pacifists. The rabbis wanted to brush aside the warlike nature of the Maccabees and create a la-di-da type of beautiful kumbaya holiday. But I think that's very superficial, and also it anachronizes the whole holiday. And as long as we're on the subject of how this holiday could easily be anachronized, there are those who would like to believe that the holiday of Hanukkah is one of a fight against religious persecution and is in fact a holiday that supports the concept of religious tolerance. But the truth is, as John Levinson from Harvard has pointed out, that the Maccabees themselves were hardly tolerant. Levinson reminds us that the first fatality in the book of the Maccabees was not a Seleucid Greek, not a Syrian, but was rather a fellow Jew, a Hellenist. So the Maccabees were actually anything but purveyors of religious freedom. If anything, one could easily argue that they were purveyors of religious coercion. There's a fascinating book written by Shia Cohen, also of Harvard, called From the Maccabees to the Mishnah. And Cohen points out that this period, the pre-exilic period between when the Second Temple was rebuilt and the temple was destroyed, was a period that actually culminated in the emergence, the birth of Rabbinic Judaism. And the story of Hanukkah is as good a starting point for understanding what that struggle was. And the truth is that the story of how the rabbis changed the message and meaning of Hanukkah is also the story of the birth of Rabbinic Judaism. And so today I will argue that in fact the legacy of Judah the Maccabee and the Hasmonean was anything but benign. So keeping in mind what we noted before, which is when the rabbis refer back to the retaking of the temple, they refer not so much to the Maccabees, but to the Hasmonean. Cohen points out that from 164 BC, which is when the Maccabee revolt took place, until 63 BC, so it's 100 years, when the Romans entered into Jerusalem, the descendants, the family of Judah the Maccabee, called the Hasmonean, actually ruled over the land of Israel. Less than 10 years after Judah Maccabee died, his brother was appointed to be the high priest by none other than the arch-enemy Antiochus. So the Maccabees got into bed pretty quickly with the ruling power. The story of the Hasmonean is actually the remarkable story about how a family of country priests became high priests and actually took over for the first time not only the priesthood, but also the kingship. They had an aggressive foreign policy, they had alliances with the Romans, even against the Seleucids, and carved out for themselves a kingdom that was larger than that of David and Solomon. And their fall from power, as we shall see, was caused not by only external enemies, but internal ones as well. During the reign of John Hyrcanus and Alexander Jannaeus, which went from 135 to 76 BCE, many opposed the Maccabean rule. And those that opposed them were not Hellenizers by any sense of the word. What they opposed was the autocratic ways of the Maccabees. The Hasmonean dynasty actually became very corrupt, and their dynasty ended with the appointment of Herod the Great, who was called a half-Jew because he was a descendant of the Idumeans who had been forcibly converted to Judaism by the Maccabees. So during their more than 100-year rule, not only did they rule the Jews autocratically, but they actually forced converted peoples in the neighborhood. In the Talmud, Kedushin 66a, there is an account of the Hasmonean king Yanai. Yanai came back after conquering 60 cities, and upon his return he was very happy, so he had a celebration. There was a certain elder named Yehuda ben Gedidiah, who said to Yanai, King Yanai, be satisfied with the crown of kingship. Leave the crown of kahuna for the descendants of Aaron. So in the Talmud itself, it recognizes that inherent in the division between Moses and Aaron, there had historically been a division between church and state, if you will. And the Hasmoneans were the first to not only usurp the seat of the priesthood because they were not entitled to be high priests, but they also took over the ruling monarchy. How did Yanai react? He executed all the sages of Israel, and the world was bereft of Torah knowledge until Shimon ben Shetach came and returned the Torah to its former standing. So to paint the picture, when the Maccabees came along, it was the end of prophetic Judaism. The reason probably why the book of Maccabees was not included in the Tanakh, in the canon, was not so much because of its content, but rather because of its timing. Prophetic and scriptural Judaism had come to an end, and there was a vacuum. The Maccabees and the Hasmoneans came in to fill that vacuum with an autocratic regime which dictated both civil laws and religious laws without any tolerance at all. All of the different sects, Cohen points out, were moving away slowly from a temple-centric religion to a religion which was based on another center of gravity. To the Hasmoneans, that center of gravity was uncompromising power. To the rabbis, it revolved around learning and the study of an oral tradition which permitted the laws and the customs of the Jewish people to evolve and to have a new life. The Hasmoneans saw obviously the rabbis as a threat, and actually, as we have seen from this piece of Talmud, slaughtered them. So there was no love lost between the Hasmonean and the rabbis. This in of itself would explain why the rabbis so changed the holiday and the celebration of Hanukkah. I should say that in addition to a worship of autocratic power, the Maccabees also had a fondness for martyrdom. And this is why, while the books of the Maccabees did not appear within the canon of the Jewish so-called Old Testament, it was included, especially amongst the Orthodox Catholic canon of the New Testament, and in fact, within Orthodox Christianity, there is a celebration of the Maccabees as martyrs. We have other sources that show that the original celebration of Hanukkah was controversial, to say the least. In the Talmud Rosh Hashanah 18b, it is told that once in the city of Lod, they decreed a fast day on the holiday of Hanukkah. In response, Rabbi Eliezer went to a bathhouse, meaning to say he did something that was prohibited on a fast day, and took a bath. And Rabbi Yeshua went to a barber, likewise not something that is permitted on a fast day, and had his hair cut. These two rabbis said to the people of Lod who had fasted, go out and make another fast on account of the fast that you fasted on Hanukkah. So what we see in this little tidbit from the Talmud is both an interest on the part of the rabbis to keep some sort of celebration of Hanukkah because something did happen that was important. But on the other hand, we see the controversy of celebrating the original concept of Hanukkah, which was a celebration of a puritanical Judaism. The Talmud in Rosh Hashanah continues. On the 3rd of Tishrei, the superfluous mention of God's name was removed from secular documents. For the Greek kingdom had decreed that God's name not be mentioned. And when the Hasmoneans took power, they decreed that people should mention God's name even in secular documents. And so they would write, In the year so-and-so to Yochanan, who is the kohen gadol, the high priest, to the supreme God. When the sages heard about this matter, they were displeased, for they said, tomorrow this person will repay his debt, and the unneeded document will be found lying in a garbage heap. And so they nullified the Hasmonean decree. That day they made into a festival. So that we see that the Hasmonean based much of their rites on an ideological pivot away from anything that the foreigners had required. So if the foreigners said you can't mention God's name, the Hasmoneans put God's name wherever they could. More to the point, as we can see, in terms of giving the date of any document, it would refer to the Hasmonean high priest, and they would link his name to the supreme God. Once again, trying to convey their autocracy and the fact that they spoke on behalf of the Lord. The rabbis went ahead when they took over and took away this mention, this superfluous mention of God's name, and obviously also the linkage between the rulership, the political powers, and any aspiration to being the spokesperson for God. It is a little bit of interest that the date of this celebration, the third day of Tishrei, is the day right after Rosh Hashanah, when we also have a fast day for Gedalia, which I have mentioned in an earlier podcast. So you have this ironic combination of a mourning day for the first Jew-on-Jew assassination of a governor of Gedalia by zealots, and you also have a celebration of the removal of a decree from another autocratic, zealous regime by the name of the Hasmonean. Now we know that the blessings that we say when we light the candles, and of course in Judaism when you say a blessing, you are saying it on the commandment of the day. So the rabbis made the commandment of the day, this lighting of the symbolic candles, to commemorate this miracle, this trial, this sign. But they also preserved a historical narrative of the Maccabean revolt. And this remembrance is put into the grace after meals, the Birchat Hamazon, and also into the silent prayer, the Shemona Esrei. This narrative is recorded in the Babylonian Talmud, Shabbat 24a, and it goes as follows. And we thank you for the miracles, for the redemption, for the mighty deeds, for the saving acts, and for the wonders which you have wrought for our ancestors in those days, at this time. In the days of Mattisyahu, the son of Yochanan the high priest, the Hasmonean and his sons, when the wicked Hellenic government rose up against your people Israel to make them forget your Torah and violate the decrees of your will, but you, in your abounding mercy, stood by them in the time of their distress. You waged their battles, defended their rights, and avenged the wrongs done to them. And here's where the rabbis get a little poetic. You delivered the mighty into the hands of the weak, the many into the hands of the few, the impure into the hands of the pure, the wicked into the hands of the righteous, and the wanton sinners into the hands of those who occupy themselves with your Torah. You made a great and holy name for yourself in your world and effected a great deliverance and redemption for your people Israel to this very day. Then your children entered the shrine of your house, cleansed your temple, purified your sanctuary, kindled lights in your holy courtyards, and instituted these 8 days of Hanukkah to give thanks and praise to your great name. So the rabbis did preserve a narrative of sorts, coming right out of the book of the Maccabees. But they did introduce not simply keeping the commandments, but Oskei Toratecha, those who occupy themselves with your Torah. And of course anyone who understands the nuances of rabbinic literature knows that Osek b'Torah has more to do with the study of the Torah than it does to do necessarily with the performance or the keeping of the Torah. So while the rabbis talk about purity, and they talk about the few against the many, and the pure against the impure, they also introduce a concept of studying Torah. But the question becomes, when is this narrative recited? So the students asked the question, should the Hanukkah incident be mentioned in the benediction after meals? Should we say this during the Birchat HaMazon? Shall we assume that because it is rabbinic, it is unnecessary, or for the sake of the proclamation of the miracle, it should? Said Rabbah in the name of Rav Shura, quoting Rav Huna, it is not necessary. However, if one wishes to do it, he should incorporate it into the thanksgiving part. So here again we see that while the blessings are required, and while the lighting of the candles are required, if you wish to memorialize what the Maccabees did, you have permission to do it, but you should do it in the thanksgiving part of the prayers. And we'll see in a second what the implications of this is. Rav Huna ben Judah chanced to visit Rabbah's academy and thought to mention it, this Hanukkah memorialization, at the part of the Birchat HaMazon, the grace after meals, that talks about Uvenei Yerushalayim. It's a prayer, not a form of thanksgiving, but actually a supplication that God rebuild Jerusalem. Said Rab Sheshet to them, the rule here is the same as the rule regarding the Shemona Esrei, the silent prayer. Just as this Al Hanisim, this narrative, is incited in the prayer for the benediction of thanks, Modim Anachnu Lach, and not at a supplication, Shema Kolenu, hear our voice, so also in the grace after meals, it should be inserted at the place where we praise and thank God, and not the place where we supplicate God. If you're sensitive to the nuance here, the gist of this piece of Talmud is that, number one, the rabbis weren't all that excited about even retelling and memorializing the narrative of the Maccabees. But if you do memorialize it, make sure you memorialize it in the part of our prayers where we thank God for what He has done for us, using whatever tools He has at His disposal, including the Maccabees and the Hasmonean. But do not say it at the point in our prayers where we are asking God to return us to Jerusalem, or return us to such a temple and such a dynasty and autocratic rule. Clearly, the rabbis were very focused on making sure that the Maccabees and the Hasmonean would not come back. Now, we have to understand that when the first temple was built by Solomon, there was unanimity in terms of its holiness and in terms of the perception that the divine presence had blessed this temple. There were prophets who spoke accordingly. The second temple was a much more complex, ambiguous, and controversial endeavor. In fact, Cohen argues that all of the sects that emerged as a result of the ambiguous nature of the second temple. In Ezra chapter 3:12, we are told that when the second temple was built, the old men who had seen the first temple in its glory cried at the dedication of the second. So there were many people who felt that the second temple actually never had the presence of God. The Essenes, who lived in the desert and wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls, were a sect that actually rejected the second temple. In a sense, the Pharisees also were ambivalent about the second temple. Only the Hasmonean and the family of Tzadok, the Tzedukim, took the second temple as the basis of their power. So here we are celebrating a holiday of the rededication of the temple taken by force by zealots who were not particularly tolerant of others, who felt that prophetic Judaism had ended and now all that was remaining was to purify and to be pure to the dictates of the written Torah. There was not to be any further development. So the truth is that the story of Hanukkah is actually the story of the unwinding of biblical Judaism. It's the story of the end of prophetic Judaism and the written Bible. And it's the story of the emergence of rabbinic Judaism. And that, in fact, is what is celebrated by the rabbis with their simple pach shemen, their simple vessel of oil. For the rabbis, this was a new beginning. According to Hallel, one lights one candle on the first day, and one adds to it, mosef v'holech, adding and going forward. For the rabbis, this was not the rededication of an old temple, but it was actually finding the pure shemen, the pure oil, that would light and carry the Jews forward as they used their imagination to reclaim old traditions and remake old narratives. And in fact, I believe that's what we celebrate on Hanukkah. The Hadlik Ner Shel Hanukkah, lighting the light of the Hanukkah lamp, is lighting the light of a new beginning, the beginning of a new Judaism. The lesson of a Hanukkah is not so much of tolerance, not so much of a pacifistic nature, but much more so a celebration of a religion based on not an institution built out of rocks and stone, but with the authority of learning and study and scholarship. And in so doing, the rabbis were engaged with Jewish history, did not nullify Jewish history. Yes, they repackaged it. And so in a very real sense, the holiday of Hanukkah pays homage to the power of the human being to adopt, to grow, to enlighten and be enlightened by others, and to move forward, and to reject a Judaism that is hijacked by a minority who attempts to interject God in places and documents where he need not be, who is militant where it need not be militant, who in order to achieve their end goals are willing to corrupt, compromise, and exploit weaknesses in democratic governance, who focus their attention on the holiness of temples and land, and are willing to turn violence against their own people in order to achieve their ends, who reject the balance of power between the priestly and the political and commingle the two, and are willing to do anything to achieve their ends, who claim falsely to have the lineage and the authority to make those changes and use force to convert and to manipulate anything that lies in their path. Chag Chanukah Sameach. Have a very happy, happy Hanukkah. As always, we end Madlik with a song, and today we end with Light One Candle by Peter, Paul, and Mary, which, although it is not accurate in terms of the original Maccabees story, I think does very well convey the message that the rabbis of the Talmud took to be the meaning of the lights of Hanukkah. Enjoy.
Light one candle for the Maccabee children, with thanks that their light didn't die. Light one candle for the pain they endured when their right to exist was denied. Light one candle for the terrible sacrifice justice and freedom demand. Light one candle for the wisdom to know when the peacemaker's time is at hand. Don't let the light go out, it's lasted for so many years. Don't let the light go out, let it shine through our lamentation. Light one candle for the strength that we need to never become our own foe. And light one candle for those who are suffering, pain we learned so long ago. Light one candle for all we believe in, that anger not tear us apart. Light one candle to bind us together with peace as a song in our heart. Don't let the light go out, it's lasted for so many years. Don't let the light go out, let it shine through our love and our tears. Don't let the light go out, it's lasted for so many years. Don't let the light go out, let it shine through our love and our tears.
What is the memory that's valued so highly that we keep it alive in that flame? What's the commitment to those who have died? They cry out they've not died in vain. We have come this far, always believing that justice will somehow prevail. This is the burden, this is the prize.